You're now looking at the Jungfrau in the Swiss Alps, standing at 4,158 meters. It's one of Europe's most iconic snow-covered peaks. From here, you can admire glaciers, valleys, and lakes, an unforgettable panoramic view. Riding the cogwheel. Train to the top of Europe is a once-in-a-lifetime experience. Whether hiking in summer or skiing in winter, this is a paradise for nature lovers. The evening sun dipped low across the western horizon, washing the little town in soft golden light. The air was quiet, broken only by the faint creak of swinging signs and the distant call of a crow. Down the dirt road, a lone rider appeared. His horse moved slow, steady, its hooves stirring small clouds of dust. The man in the saddle was worn from the trail. His coat carried the marks of travel, and his wide-brimmed hat kept his eyes hidden in shadow. To the townsfolk, he looked like nothing more than another drifter cowboy passing through, just a man with no roots, no ties, and no reason to stay. But one pair of eyes lingered longer than the rest. A young woman stood at the doorway of the general store, her hands folded in front of her apron. She watched as the stranger rode past, something about him tugging gently at her thoughts. She didn't know his name. She didn't know his story. And yet she felt, deep down, that he carried more than just a dusty saddle and a weary heart. This was how their story began. The bell above the general store door gave a soft jingle as it opened. The air inside was warm, carrying the faint scent of flour, soap, and old wood. Behind the counter, the young woman looked up, brushing a strand of hair from her face. The man stepped in slowly, his boots leaving faint marks of dust across the worn floorboards. He removed his hat, giving a small nod, his eyes, clear and steady, meeting hers for the first time. She noticed the lines around them, carved by years of sun and silence. His face spoke of miles traveled and burdens carried. "Evenin'," he said simply, his voice deep but calm. "Evenin'," she replied, almost whispering, though her heart beat quicker than she liked to admit. He walked toward the counter, glancing at the shelves, not rushing, not asking for much, just looking, as though he belonged nowhere and everywhere all at once. To her, he was a stranger, just another cowboy who'd passed through by morning. But something in his stillness, in the quiet weight he carried, told her there was more beneath the dust, and she wanted to know what it was. The cowboy set his hat down gently on the counter, his eyes scanning the shelves, but not seeming to settle on anything. The young woman, still unsure of him, reached behind and poured a simple glass of water from a jug. "Long ride?" she asked softly, pushing the glass toward him. His gaze lifted to hers, steady and unreadable. Then, with the faintest nod, he reached for the glass. For a moment, their fingers nearly touched, and though it was nothing more than a passing gesture, she felt a strange flutter deep within. He drank slowly, as though he hadn't tasted water in days, then set the glass down with quiet care. "Much obliged," he said, his words low and deliberate. She studied him carefully. He didn't seem like the others who came through town. Loud, restless, always in a hurry to move on. No, this man carried himself differently. His silence spoke louder than words. She wanted to ask where he came from, where he was going. But instead, she only said, "If you need supplies, let me know." He gave the smallest of smiles, though it barely touched his eyes. "Maybe I will," he answered. News traveled fast in a town that small. By the time the cowboy had finished his water, the whispers had already begun. Out on the boardwalk, a pair of old men leaned on the railing, their voices low. "Another drifter," one muttered, spitting into the dirt. "Won't stay long. None of 'em ever do." A woman carrying a basket of bread slowed her pace, casting a careful glance through the store window. Behind her, a boy fiddled with his slingshot, watching the horse tied just outside. Even the horse looked different. Strong, proud. The kind that wasn't usually seen in a place like this. Inside, the young woman pretended not to notice the stares. She arranged a few jars on the shelf, though her eyes kept drifting back to the stranger. He seemed untouched by the town's suspicion, as if he'd grown used to carrying it on his shoulders. He picked up a small packet of coffee beans, studied it, then set it back down. "People here don't take kindly to outsiders," she said gently, almost as a warning. His lips curved just slightly, though the expression was hard to read. "Then I reckon I'll have to give them time," he replied. The store had grown quiet again, the murmur of the townsfolk fading as the day stretched on. The cowboy stood at the counter, his stance calm, his eyes steady as he studied the little details of the room, the jars, the lanterns, the neat order she kept. The young woman found herself wanting to fill the silence. She wasn't usually one to ask questions, but something about him felt different. "Not from around here, are you?" she said lightly, her voice carrying both curiosity and caution. He shook his head once. "Just passing through." She nodded, though his answer told her almost nothing. "Long way from home, then?" His gaze met hers, and for a brief second she thought she saw a flicker of something. Loneliness, maybe, or memories too heavy to speak of. "Home's a hard word," he said simply. Her fingers traced the edge of the counter as she studied him. He wasn't rude. He wasn't closed off in anger. He was just careful, like a man who had learned to guard his heart. And though she knew better than to pry, she couldn't help but wonder what story lay behind those guarded eyes. As the Orchua sun dipped lower, the town settled into its evening rhythm. Horses were stabled, lanterns flickered to life in windows, and the air grew cooler with the coming night. The cowboy sat outside on the old bench, his shoulders relaxed, but his eyes fixed on the horizon. The world seemed to slow around him, as though he belonged to a different time. His hat lay in his lap, his hands resting steady on the brim, while the glow of sunset painted his profile in quiet gold. From the doorway, the young woman paused, her work inside the store finished for the day. She studied him for a moment, unseen. He looked so still, so calm, and yet she sensed something heavy inside him, like a man carrying more silence than he knew what to do with. Most men in town gathered at the saloon, laughing too loud, drinking too much. But not him. He seemed to prefer the company of the sky, the dust, and his own thoughts. She stepped onto the boardwalk, meaning to walk past, but something made her linger. "You like the view out here?" she asked softly. He glanced at her, his eyes reflecting the fading light. "Reminds me of home," he murmured. The bench creaked softly as she lowered herself onto the far end, leaving a space of silence between them. For a while, they both watched the sky change colors, the day giving way to night. She folded her hands in her lap. "You travel alone?" she asked, her tone gentle, more curious than pressing. He nodded once. "Always have." There was no boast in his voice, no pride, just a quiet truth. "Doesn't get lonely?" she asked, tilting her head toward him. His eyes stayed on the horizon, but she caught the faintest pause before he answered. Sometimes, but I've learned not to expect much else. The words lingered in the cool air, and she felt them settle in her chest. There was something familiar in his loneliness, though she couldn't explain why. I suppose folks stay where they're needed, she said softly. At that, his gaze shifted toward her, steady and searching. And you? Where are you needed? She looked down at her hands, a small smile touching her lips. Here, I guess. Someone's got to keep the store running. For the first time, she thought she saw it. A glimmer of warmth in his eyes, fragile but real. Night settled gently over the little town, the lanterns flickering like stars brought down to earth. On the bench outside the store, the young woman and the cowboy shared a quiet stillness, the kind that spoke more than words ever could. But silence rarely lasted long in a town where everyone knew everyone else. Two women passed by with baskets on their arms, their whispers sharp in the cool air. Look at her, sitting out there with him. An older man tugged at his hat as he walked by, giving the stranger a long, cautious glance before moving along. Even a group of children running toward home slowed to stare before disappearing down the road. The young woman felt the weight of their eyes. Her cheeks warmed, and she shifted slightly, straightening her posture. She wasn't ashamed, but she knew how tongues wagged in a place like this. The cowboy, however, seemed unmoved. He leaned back against the bench, his gaze still calm, his presence unshaken. They'll talk, she murmured, her eyes fixed on the street. He gave a small shrug, almost a smile. Let 'em. Talking's all some folks know how to do. His quiet steadiness settled her heart more than she expected. The morning sun spilled gently into the store, filling it with warmth and the quiet hum of a new day. The young woman moved about her work, arranging jars and lifting supplies from the back room. She bent to lift a sack of flour, her arms straining under the weight. Before she could steady herself, a hand reached out, firm, certain, and took the burden from her grasp. She looked up quickly, startled, and found the cowboy standing close. Without a word, he hoisted the sack onto his shoulder with practiced ease, as though it weighed nothing at all. "You shouldn't carry that alone," he said quietly, his voice low but certain. For a moment, she didn't know what to say. No one ever offered help, not in a place where everyone kept to themselves, where work was expected, and struggles overlooked. "Thank you," she managed, her tone softer than she intended. He set the sack down gently where it belonged, then straightened. His eyes met hers for just a heartbeat before drifting away again. It was a small thing, nothing grand, but in that quiet gesture she saw something different in him, something kind, something human beneath the dust. By mid-morning, the work had eased, and the store sat in a hush. The young woman moved into the small kitchen tucked at the back, where a kettle whistled gently on the stove. She glanced toward the cowboy, who stood near the shelves, as if debating whether to leave or linger. A quiet thought rose in her chest, before she could stop it. "Sit," she said softly. "You look like you could use a proper meal." For a moment, he hesitated, as though unused to being invited to stay. But finally, he nodded and lowered himself into the chair at the small wooden table. She set down a plate. Biscuits, eggs, nothing fancy, just what she had, and poured 2 cups of coffee. He looked at the food, then at her, his expression unreadable. "You didn't have to," he said quietly. "I know," she replied, a small smile touching her lips. "But I wanted to." He picked up a biscuit, his hands rough against the delicate plate. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight softer than before. "Been a long time since someone offered me a meal." The words stayed with her long, after the silence returned. The cowboy ate slowly, as though each bite carried more weight than just food. His gaze stayed low, fixed on the plate, yet his shoulders seemed less heavy than they had the day before. The young woman sipped her coffee, watching him carefully. She didn't want to press, but the silence between them felt like an open door, waiting for something to step through. "You've been on the road a long time," she said gently. He lifted his eyes, steady but shadowed. For a moment, she thought, he might brush the question aside. Instead, he set the biscuit down and leaned back in his chair. "Longer than I care to count," he admitted. Her brow softened. No family waiting somewhere? No place to go back to? His jaw tightened slightly, his hands folding together on the table. "Had a place once," he said at last. "Had people too. But life has a way of taking more than it gives." The tight words hung in the quiet air, heavy but true. He didn't explain further, and she didn't ask. Instead, she only nodded, her eyes meeting his with quiet understanding. For the first time, she felt him trust her with a fragment of who he was. The afternoon sun beat down on the quiet street, warming the wooden boards of the storefronts. Near the side of the general store, a wagon wheel lay broken, its spokes bent and useless. The young woman stood with her hands on her hips, frowning at the damage. It would take days to have someone from the blacksmith shop spare the time, and, until then, she couldn't haul goods from the station. The cowboy crouched beside the wheel, running a hand over the splintered wood. "Don't look too bad," he said calmly. "Just needs some fixing." Before she could reply, he rolled up his sleeves and set to work. His hands moved with practiced ease, steady and sure, as though this wasn't the first wheel he'd ever mended. She handed him a small basket of nails, and he gave a quiet nod of thanks without looking up. She watched him in silence, noticing how focused he became when working, how his calm presence seemed to settle the air itself. He wasn't a man of many words, but in the way he worked, in the quiet care he gave to even small things, she saw a piece of the life he rarely spoke about. And she found herself wanting to see more. By late afternoon, the broken wheel stood, firm again, strong as the day it was first built. The cowboy leaned back on his heels, wiping his hands on a rag, his movements calm and unhurried. The sound of hammering had drawn a few eyes. An older man stopped on his way down the street, tipping his hat with a nod. "Fine work," he muttered, his tone carrying a hint of respect. A young mother lingered with her little boy, who tugged at her hand, whispering, "Ma, he fixed it good as new." Even two boys who often stirred trouble in town stood nearby, wide-eyed with something like admiration. The young woman noticed it too, the way the air around him had shifted. Where once there had been suspicion, now there was curiosity, perhaps even a sliver of trust. She stepped closer, her voice soft but filled with pride. "I'd have had to wait a week for the blacksmith. You saved me a lot of trouble." He shrugged lightly as though it was nothing. Just seemed like it needed doing. But in that moment, surrounded by quiet nods of approval, she realized he was beginning to leave his mark on more than just the wagon. The evening air was cool, carrying the faint scent of sage and wild grass. The young woman walked with her, basket in hand, her steps light on the dusty road. Beside her, The cowboy moved with unhurried steadiness, the brim of his hat low against the fading glow of the sky. For a while, neither spoke. The quiet between them felt comfortable, filled only by the rustle of wind through the fields. But she sensed there was more behind his silence, something waiting to be spoken. "You never stay long anywhere, do you?" she asked at last, her tone gentle, not accusing. He gave a small shake of his head. "Never found a place worth staying." Her eyes studied him in the fading light. "Or maybe you never let yourself." That made him pause, his boots scuffing lightly against the dirt. He glanced at her, and for once his guard seemed to falter. "Sometimes stayin' costs more than leavin'," he said quietly. The words carried weight, unspoken stories resting behind them. She didn't press, didn't demand answers. She only nodded, her heart stirring with a mix of sadness and curiosity. For the first time, she wondered if he was running from something or someone. Morning broke soft and golden, spilling light across the empty street. The cowboy stood at the hitching post, tightening the saddle straps on his horse. The animal was tall and proud, its coat shining like polished bronze in the dawn. The young woman stepped outside with her broom in hand, intending to sweep the boardwalk, but her eyes caught on the saddle, too fine, too carefully crafted to belong to a man with no roots. The leather was etched with detailed tooling, the silver buckles catching the first rays of sunlight. Her gaze moved to the horse itself. It was the kind bred for strength and endurance, well-fed and cared for, unlike the tired stock most travelers brought through town. She leaned the broom against the wall, studying him with new curiosity. "That's no ordinary horse," she said softly. He glanced at her, his face calm, unreadable. "She's carried me a long way." Her eyes narrowed just slightly, her thoughts churning. A man drifting from place to place didn't carry such wealth on his saddle. Something about him didn't fit the story he allowed others to believe. And for the first time, she wondered, who was he really? By midday, whispers wound their way through town once more. But this time, they carried a different edge. In the dim light of the saloon, men hunched over their mugs, talking low but eager. "That horse of his," one muttered, "ain't no beast you buy with trail wages." Another leaned forward, his voice rough. "And that saddle? Silver buckles like that don't come cheap. Man claims he's just passing through. But I say he's something else." The barkeep, polishing a glass behind the counter, kept his eyes low, though his ears stayed sharp. He'd seen drifters before. Broken men, desperate men. But this one didn't carry desperation. He carried something heavier, something hidden. Near the window, a woman shifted her basket on her lap. Her tone hushed. "Could be he's running from something or someone." Outside, the cowboy moved with his usual calm, brushing down his horse in the golden light, unaware, or perhaps unconcerned, that eyes were on him. And as the whispers grew, so did the mystery. He was no longer just a drifter in their eyes. He was a man with secrets, and secrets always had a way of stirring a town awake. The night was still, the only sound the distant call of crickets, and the creak of the porch boards beneath their chairs. A lantern glowed between them, painting the cowboy's face in soft light, shadows deepening the lines around his eyes. For a long time, she said nothing, content to share the silence. But the questions that had been building in her heart pressed too strongly to ignore. "Who are you, really?" she asked at last, her voice quiet but steady. "You're not just some drifter, are you?" He turned the brim of his hat slowly in his hands, his gaze dropping to the ground. For a moment, she thought he might stay silent forever. But then he sighed, a sound heavy with years untold. "Truth is," he began, his voice low, almost reluctant, "I once had more than I ever needed. Land, cattle, money. Folks knew my name, but I walked away from it." Her eyes widened slightly, though she stayed still, letting the words sink in. "Why?" she whispered. He lifted his gaze to hers, and in it she saw something raw, something broken. "Because having everything don't mean much when you've lost what matters most." The cowboy sat in silence for a long while, the lantern flame flickering gently between them. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, but each word carried the weight of old wounds. "I had a wife once," he said quietly. "A good woman. Strong. Kind. We built a life together on that land. Cattle, fields, a house that always smelled of her bread in the oven." His eyes drifted to the distance, though there was nothing to see but the night. But life has a way of taking. A fever came through one winter, took her before spring had a chance to thaw the ground, left me with land, money, and a house that felt hollow without her laughter. The young woman's heart tightened. She could almost see it. The wide house, the empty rooms, the man who wandered them with nothing but grief for company. "So I left it," he continued. "Left it all? Figured if I kept moving, I wouldn't have to hear the silence anymore." His hands tightened on the brim of his hat. "But no matter how far you ride, some things ride with you." The young woman's eyes glistened as she whispered, "I'm sorry." And for the first time, he let himself meet her gaze without turning away. The cowboy's words lingered in the still night, heavy as the silence that followed. He sat with his shoulders bowed, his hat turning slowly in his hands, as though the telling had cost him more than he'd expected. The young woman watched him, her heart aching at the quiet pain in his eyes. For so long she had seen him as a man of mystery, a figure who carried the dust of endless roads. But now she saw something deeper, a man who had loved, who had lost, and who had been running ever since. Without thinking, she reached across the small table, her hand resting lightly on his. His skin was rough, calloused by years of work, but beneath her touch she felt the tremor of someone who had carried sorrow far too long. He looked at her then, truly looked, and in his eyes she saw both surprise and something else. Something fragile, like a door beginning to open. "You've lost much," she whispered, her voice steady but tender. "But maybe life still has something left to give you." For a long moment, neither moved, and in the lantern light, the quiet between them felt less like emptiness, more like possibility. Morning came soft and golden, the first rays spilling across the rooftops and washing the town in quiet light. The streets were still, the world hushed, as if holding its breath for what came next. The cowboy stood by the railing of the general store, his hat resting in his hands. Beside him, the young woman leaned lightly against the post, her gaze on the horizon where the sun climbed slow and steady. For the first time in years, his eyes didn't follow the horizon with restless longing. Instead, he felt the stillness of the town seep into him, the sound of roosters crowing, the scent of bread rising from a nearby kitchen, the warmth of someone standing close beside him. "I should be riding on," he said softly, though the words carried no weight. She turned her face toward him, a small, knowing smile touching her lips. Or maybe, she whispered, you've already found where you're meant to be. His gaze lingered on her, on the quiet strength in her eyes. And in that moment, he knew. He'd spent enough years running. He placed his hat back on his head, not to leave, but to stay. And the day began, not with an ending, but with a beginning.